We all recognize moments that divide our lives into before and after. Mine happened on a crisp autumn evening when my husband of 17 years tried to destroy me financially, unaware that I'd been quietly building the very institution that would determine his fate. When Richard Grayson walked out of our bedroom with a suitcase and an ultimatum, he had no idea I was the controlling shareholder of the bank he was threatening to use against me. This is the story of how I turned a devastating betrayal into the most satisfying checkmate of my life. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from, and if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. The realization that my marriage was over came with the sound of a drawer closing too carefully. It was a Thursday evening in October, and I'd just returned from visiting my sister in Chicago. The house was unusually quiet when I walked in. No TV murmuring from the den, no music from Richard's study, just the soft click of expensive luggage latches from our bedroom upstairs. "Richard?" I called, setting my bags down in the foyer of our Westchester home. The marble floors amplified my footsteps as I climbed the stairs, a sense of dread building with each step. I found him in our bedroom, meticulously folding dress shirts into a large Toomey suitcase, the one we'd bought for our anniversary trip to the Maldives 2 years ago. His back was to me, but I could see his reflection in the dresser mirror. His face was set with that same determined expression he wore when preparing for high-stakes negotiations. "You're home early," he said without turning around. Not a question. Or a greeting. Just a flat observation tinged with annoyance. "Flight got in ahead of schedule," I replied, watching him continue packing as if my presence was a minor inconvenience. "Going somewhere?" Richard finally turned to face me. At 52, he still had the same commanding presence that had drawn me to him in our 20s. Salt and pepper hair perfectly styled, posture impeccable in his tailored shirt and slacks. But his eyes had changed over the years, colder now, more calculating than the warm hazel gaze that once made me feel like the center of his universe. "I'm moving out, Amanda," he said with practiced calm. "I've been waiting for you to return to discuss terms." Terms? The word felt foreign on my tongue. "We're not in a boardroom, Richard." He sighed with the exaggerated patience he reserved. For people he considered intellectually inferior, a category I'd apparently joined. "I've been unhappy for some time. We both have. It's time to end this arrangement and move forward separately." Arrangement. Not marriage. Not partnership. Arrangement. See? My voice sounded distant to my own ears. "And when exactly did we both become unhappy?" I seemed to have missed that memo. He closed the suitcase with deliberate care. "I've drafted a separation agreement that's fair to both parties. My attorney will contact you tomorrow with details." The clinical detachment in his voice triggered something inside me, a switch flipping from shock to anger. "You've been planning this," I stated. "For how long?" "That's hardly relevant now. Indulge me." My voice remained steady despite the earthquake happening within. Richard checked his watch, a dismissive gesture he'd perfected over years of cutting business meetings short. "Amanda, I have dinner reservations. We can discuss details tomorrow when emotions aren't running high." "Whose emotions? Yours seem perfectly controlled." I moved toward his closet, noticing now the empty spaces where his favorite suits had hung. "Who is she?" A flicker of surprise crossed his face. "That's not—" "Don't insult my intelligence on top of everything else," I interrupted. 17 years of marriage, and you've never once suggested we were both unhappy. This isn't a mutual decision. This is you leaving for someone else." He straightened his cuffs, a nervous habit I'd observed countless times before important meetings. "Her name is Vanessa Porter. She's the new head of strategic investments at the firm." Of course. Vanessa Porter. 15 years younger, Stanford MBA, featured in last month's Business Insider as a rising star in venture capital. I'd met her, At the firm's holiday party last December, noticed how she'd laughed too enthusiastically at Richard's jokes. "How cliché of you, Richard," I said softly. The middle-aged executive and the ambitious young colleague. "Did you pull that straight from a corporate romance novel?" His jaw tightened. "Mock all you want, but Vanessa understands my world in ways you never could. We're intellectual equals." The casual cruelty of the statement should have hurt more than it did. Instead, it clarified everything. "And what exactly do you think I don't understand about your world?" I asked, genuinely curious about this version of me he'd constructed to justify his betrayal. "Amanda, let's not make this uglier than necessary." He picked up the suitcase. "My attorney will explain everything tomorrow. In the meantime, I've temporarily frozen our joint accounts as a standard precaution during separation. You'll have limited access until we formalize arrangements." There it was, the financial move I should have anticipated from a man like Richard, cutting off resources first, negotiating from weakness second. A classic tactic I'd seen him use in corporate takeovers countless times. "You've frozen our accounts," I repeated, the full implications settling over me. "Without discussion, without warning." "It's standard practice," he responded with practiced neutrality. "My attorney advised it to protect assets until we reach an agreement. You'll have access to a household account with reasonable funds." "Reasonable? According to whom?" I asked. "You?" "Amanda, you've never had to worry about money during our marriage, and that won't change. But I need to ensure you don't make impulsive decisions while being emotional." The condescension was breathtaking. In Richard's mind, I'd always been a supporting character in his success story, the presentable wife who organized dinner parties for his clients and managed our social calendar, the English literature major who'd given up her publishing career to support his ambitions, a dependent who needed monitoring and control. "What about the Middleton Foundation board meeting tomorrow?" I asked. "I'm supposed to present the annual grant proposals." Richard pulled his phone from his pocket, checking something. "I've already spoken with Marcus. He understands you'll need time away from foundation matters given our personal situation." Marcus Weldon, the foundation's chairman and Richard's longtime friend. Of course, Richard had already managed that angle, likely presenting himself as the concerned husband looking out for his fragile wife's well-being. "How thoughtful of you to rearrange my professional commitments without consulting me," I said, the anger now fully eclipsing the shock. "Any other aspects of my life you've taken the liberty of managing on your way out the door?" He picked up his suitcase, expression hardening. "I've tried to make this transition as smooth as possible. If you insist on being difficult, we can handle everything through attorneys." As he moved toward the door, a terrible thought occurred to me. "What about my mother's medical treatments? That comes from our joint account." Richard paused, and I saw a flicker of genuine discomfort cross his face, the first real emotion he'd displayed. "I'll ensure those continue, of course. Send the details to my assistant. Send the details to my assistant. As if my mother's Parkinson's treatments were a minor scheduling matter to be delegated." He continued toward the door, then stopped, reaching into his jacket pocket. "I almost forgot. You should probably have this." He placed a white envelope on the dresser. "It's information about the household account you'll have access to during the separation. The credit cards in our joint name have been suspended, but there's a new card with a reasonable limit for essentials." Reasonable limit. Essentials. The words echoed in my head as he walked out of our bedroom, down the stairs, and out of our home without looking back. The soft click of the front door closing felt more final than a slam would have. I stood frozen for several minutes, the white envelope untouched on the dresser. Then, mechanically, I moved to the window in time to see Richard's Tesla pulling out of our circular driveway. In the glow of the security lights, I caught a glimpse of a figure in the passenger seat, young, blonde, animated as she spoke. Vanessa. Porter hadn't even waited in the wings. She'd been waiting in the car. The envelope seemed to glow against the dark wood of the dresser. I finally picked it up, tearing it open with shaking fingers. Inside was a new debit card in my name, along with a brief typewritten note explaining that the associated account had a $3,000 monthly limit for household necessities and personal expenses. After 17 years of marriage, during which I'd managed our household, organized charity events that raised millions, and supported Richard's climb to becoming one of New York's most successful venture capitalists, he'd reduced my existence to a $3,000 monthly allowance. My phone buzzed with an incoming text. Without looking, I knew it would be Richard with some final instruction or reminder of my new financial constraints. Instead, it was from Eleanor, my oldest friend since college, and the CFO of Northeastern Regional Bank. A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off. Just heard about the emergency board meeting tomorrow morning. Is everything okay? Call me. I stared at the message, momentarily confused. Then understanding dawned with crystalline clarity. Of course. Richard wouldn't just freeze our personal accounts. He would use his connections at Northeastern Regional, where we held most of our assets and where he'd cultivated relationships with the executive team for years, to ensure I couldn't access any significant funds during the separation. What Richard didn't know, what I had carefully ensured he never knew, was that Eleanor wasn't just my friend, she was my colleague, and Northeastern Regional wasn't just any bank. It was my bank. 7 years ago, using family money Richard knew nothing about and a network of investment vehicles structured specifically to maintain anonymity, I had become Northeastern Regional Bank's largest individual shareholder. Through a private holding company registered in my grandmother's maiden name, I controlled 23% of the bank's voting shares, more than enough to influence board decisions when necessary. The emergency board meeting Eleanor mentioned could only mean one thing. Richard was moving quickly to secure the board's cooperation in restricting my financial access. He would present himself as the concerned husband trying to protect assets from an emotionally unstable wife during a difficult separation. He would leverage his friendships with board members, remind them of the business he'd brought to the bank over the years, and paint me as a potential liability. I picked up my phone and dialed Eleanor's number. She answered on the first ring. Amanda? What's going on? Marcus called for an emergency meeting at 8 a.m. tomorrow, and the agenda only says, Account Security Protocols, Grayson Holdings. Richard's left me, I said, my voice steadier than I expected. He's moved out and frozen our joint accounts. Now he's apparently taking it a step further. Eleanor's sharp intake of breath carried through the phone. That son of a bitch, are you okay? No, I admitted. But I will be. We need to talk before that meeting tomorrow. I'll be at your house in 30 minutes, she said without hesitation. After hanging up, I walked slowly around the bedroom I'd shared with Richard for nearly 2 decades. The half-empty closet, the vacant spaces on his side of the bathroom counter, the absence of the leather portfolio he always kept on his nightstand. He'd clearly been removing things gradually, planning his exit with the same methodical precision he applied to business deals. I sat at my vanity table, staring at my reflection. At 48, I still had the high cheekbones and clear blue, eyes that had once made Richard call me his classic beauty. My dark hair, now streaked with silver I'd chosen not to hide, was pulled back in the simple chignon I favored. I looked composed, almost serene, a stark contrast to the chaos inside me. Intellectual equals, Richard had said about Vanessa Porter. As if my value as his wife had been diminished by my lack of an MBA or executive's titles. As if the woman, who had quietly orchestrated one of the most significant share acquisitions in Northeastern Regional's history, without alerting a single financial journalist or triggering any regulatory disclosure requirements, was somehow intellectually inferior. opened my laptop, and logged into a secure email account Richard knew nothing about. I sent a brief message to my attorney, not the family lawyer Richard and I shared, but my personal counsel who had helped structure my bank acquisition years ago. Need to activate contingency protocol. Richard leaving, freezing assets. Emergency. Bank board meeting tomorrow 8 a.m. Please be available. Then I opened the hidden compartment in my jewelry box and removed a small USB drive containing all the documentation of my ownership structure at Northeastern Regional. The elaborate corporate shell game that disguised my position as the bank's largest individual shareholder had been designed for exactly this type of situation, not necessarily a divorce, but a moment when revealing my true financial position would be necessary. The doorbell rang precisely 30 minutes after my call with Eleanor. I tucked the USB drive into my pocket and went downstairs to let her in. Eleanor Campbell had been my roommate at Vassar before going on to get her MBA at Wharton. While I had ostensibly stepped back from career ambitions to support Richard, Eleanor had risen through the ranks of the banking world. She stood on my doorstep, still in her work clothes, a tailored navy suit and sensible heels, her red hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. She took one look at my face and pulled me into a tight hug. "I brought reinforcements," she said, holding up a bottle of Macallan 18. "Let's talk about strategy." As we settled in the kitchen, the room Richard rarely entered and where I felt most comfortable, Eleanor poured 2 generous glasses of scotch. "How much does he know?" she asked, cutting straight to the heart of the matter. "Nothing," I confirmed. "The ownership structure has held. He has no idea about my position at the bank." Eleanor nodded, a small, satisfied smile forming. Then tomorrow's meeting just became a lot more interesting. "He'll try to convince the board to restrict my access to all our accounts and assets," I said, sipping the scotch and feeling its warmth spread through my chest. "He'll present it as a standard protective measure during a high asset separation. And Marcus will back him," Eleanor added. "Those two have been in each other's pockets for years." I nodded, the outlines of a plan already forming in my mind. "I need to talk to Thomas before the meeting." Thomas Reynolds was the bank's CEO, a fair-minded executive who had always treated me with respect during our social interactions, unaware that I was actually his largest shareholder. "I'll set it up," Eleanor said, already typing on her phone. "First thing tomorrow before the board convenes." Perfect. I took another sip of scotch, feeling the initial shock of Richard's betrayal giving way to a cold, clear focus. By this time tomorrow, Richard will understand exactly who he's tried to cut off financially. Eleanor raised her glass in a toast. To underestimate women and the men who regret dismissing them. As we clinked glasses, I felt a strange sense of calm settling over me. Richard had made a catastrophic miscalculation, one that would cost him far more than he could imagine. He had dismissed me as intellectually inferior while I had been quietly positioning myself as the financial power behind his favorite institution. The irony was almost perfect. Almost. "One more thing," I said to Eleanor. "I need to know everything about Vanessa Porter's finances, where she banks, her investment portfolio, debt structure, everything." Eleanor's eyebrow raised. "Planning to go nuclear already?" "No," I replied, swirling the amber liquid in my glass. "Just gathering intelligence. In chess, you don't announce your strategy until you've positioned every piece exactly where it needs to be." As the grandfather clock in the hallway struck midnight, I realized that the marriage I thought would last a lifetime had ended. But something else was beginning. Richard Grayson had tried to cut me off financially, never suspecting that I controlled the very institution he was attempting to use against me. His first move had been made. Now it was my turn. The morning after Richard left, I woke at 5 a.m. after barely 2 hours of fitful sleep. Eleanor had gone home around 1:30, promising to pick me up at 6:45 for our pre-meeting conversation with Thomas Reynolds. In the gray pre-dawn light, I stood under the shower, letting scalding water wash over me as I prepared for the day that would redefine my marriage, my finances, and perhaps my entire future. Our story hadn't begun with betrayal. Richard and I had met 20 years earlier at a charity auction for the Metropolitan Museum of Art. I was working in publishing then, an assistant editor at a prestigious literary house, passionate about contemporary fiction and dreaming of discovering the next great American novel. At 32, Richard was already making waves in venture capital, a rising star at Hamilton Partners with a reputation for identifying promising startups before anyone else saw their potential. I remembered exactly what he'd been wearing that night, a perfectly tailored charcoal suit that contrasted with the more flamboyant styles of the other finance types in attendance. He'd been bidding on a first-edition Hemingway, and I'd been impressed by his knowledge of literature. We'd talked for hours after the auction closed, first at the event, and then at a small wine bar in the village. Most people in your field just collect books as status symbols, I'd observed, somewhat judgmentally in retrospect. He'd smiled, a genuine smile that reached his eyes, not the calculated expression I'd grown familiar with in later years. I suppose some do, but words have always been my first love. Finance is just what I happen to be good at. Our courtship had been a whirlwind of intellectual conversations, gallery openings, and weekend trips to small New England towns with historic bookshops. 6 months after we met, Richard proposed during a picnic in Central Park with a vintage emerald ring that had belonged to his grandmother. "I don't want the standard diamond everyone expects," he'd explained. "You're not a standard woman, Amanda." The early years of our marriage had been genuinely happy. We'd moved from the city to a Victorian house in Westchester that needed substantial renovation, a project we tackled together with enthusiasm. Richard's career continued its meteoric rise, while I advanced to senior editor at my publishing house. The first significant shift came 7 years into our marriage when Richard was offered a partnership at Grayson Halliday, one of New York's most prestigious venture capital firms. The position came with substantial responsibilities and expectations, including unspoken ones about the kind of spouse a partner should have. "They want me to focus on bringing in clients from old money circles," Richard had explained. "People who are more comfortable with tradition, who responds to a certain type of social environment." The implication had been clear, though neither of us explicitly acknowledged it. My publishing career, which required evening events and weekend work, was becoming an inconvenience to Richard's new position. The partners' wives were women who managed philanthropy, not careers, who organized dinner parties and chaired museum boards. I hadn't fought the transition as hard as I should have. That was a truth I'd been reluctant to acknowledge, even to myself. The publishing industry had been changing in ways that diminished my early passion. Conglomeration had reduced editorial autonomy. Profit margins had become the primary consideration in acquisition decisions. The dream of discovering voices that would reshape American literature had given way to chasing predictable bestsellers and celebrity memoirs. So when Richard suggested I take a break to support his partnership transition, I'd agreed, telling myself it was temporary. I would use the time to write the novel I'd always planned, to reimagine my career on my own terms. The novel never materialized. Instead, I found myself drawn into the philanthropic circles that orbited Richard's professional world. I joined the board of the Middleton Foundation, which funded arts education in underserved communities. I organized fundraisers that grew increasingly successful each year. I developed genuine friendships with several of the women in our social circle, women I'd initially dismissed as trophy wives, but came to respect for their strategic approach to philanthropy and their quiet influence. One of those women was Margaret Prescott, the widow of banking magnate William Prescott. At 72, Margaret had been largely invisible to the men in the financial world, despite controlling her late husband's substantial fortune. They dismissed her as a socialite who relied on advisors to manage wealth she hadn't earned. Reality, Margaret had been making investment decisions since her husband's death that outperformed most of the professional money managers in New York. Men in finance suffer from a curious blindness, Margaret told me during a private lunch at her Park Avenue apartment 7 years ago. They see what they expect to see, and they never expect a woman, particularly one past a certain age, to understand markets or strategy. She'd invited me to that lunch after observing me at foundation board meetings where I'd quietly but effectively redirected funding toward programs with measurable outcomes rather than flashy events that generated press but minimal impact. Her lunch invitation had come with an unexpected proposal. "I'm looking for a partner in a new venture," she'd explained, serving me tea in delicate Limoges cups. "Someone who understands discretion, strategy, and patience. Someone who isn't seeking public recognition." The venture, as Margaret outlined it, was the acquisition of a significant ownership position in Northeastern Regional Bank, an institution with strong fundamentals but outdated governance. She had already secured 18% of the shares through various investment vehicles and wanted to reach a controlling interest without triggering disclosure requirements. "Why me?" I'd asked, genuinely perplexed. "I don't have a finance background." Margaret had smiled, a knowing expression that reminded me she hadn't accumulated her fortune by misjudging people. "You have something more valuable. You understand power dynamics without being seduced by them. You see patterns. And," she'd added with surprising candor, "you're underestimated by exactly the right people." I hadn't immediately agreed to her proposal. In fact, I'd left her apartment that day, convinced she'd overestimated my capabilities. But Margaret was persistent, sending me research reports on the banking sector, articles about governance influence, and finally, an invitation to a private investor conference where I could observe the Northeastern Regional Management team firsthand. "Just listen," she'd advised. "See if you recognize the opportunities I do." At that conference, I'd watched Richard's friend Marcus Weldon, then a senior vice president at the bank, present growth projections with such obvious numerical manipulation that I'd been shocked none of the analysts questioned his figures. The CEO at the time, a pompous man 3 years from retirement, had dismissed legitimate concerns about their outdated digital infrastructure with patronizing assurances that traditional banking customers prefer traditional banking methods. After the presentation, I'd approached Marcus with a question about their loan loss reserves that had clearly caught him off guard. He'd recovered quickly, offering a practiced response before asking how I knew Richard Grayson. When I confirmed, I was Richard's wife. His entire demeanor had changed, becoming simultaneously more relaxed and more dismissive. "Richard never mentioned you had an interest in banking," he'd said with a chuckle. "You should come to our next dinner party. The wives usually have a separate conversation while we discuss business, but I'm sure the ladies would love your company." That evening, I called Margaret and agreed to her proposal. Over the next 6 months, we'd worked with a team of discreet financial advisors and attorneys to structure an investment vehicle that would allow us to acquire additional shares without triggering reporting requirements. The Prescott Heritage Trust, named for Margaret's maternal grandmother, became the official entity, with subsidiary LLCs handling the actual acquisitions. On paper, Margaret was the controlling partner, but our agreement gave me equal decision rights and a path to majority ownership. Richard never questioned the time I spent with Margaret. In his mind, I was cultivating a wealthy donor for the Middleton Foundation and enjoying the mentorship of a respected society figure. The substantial inheritance I'd received from my grandmother, money I'd always kept in separate accounts at Margaret's advice, provided the capital for my share of the bank acquisition without raising any red flags in our household finances. As I dressed for the board meeting, selecting a conservative navy St. John knit suit that Richard had always approved for foundation events, I reflected on how completely he had underestimated me throughout our marriage. Not maliciously, perhaps, but consistently, seeing only the version of me that fit his narrative of our relationship. The buzzing of my phone interrupted these thoughts. A text from Eleanor. Car outside in 10. Thomas agreed to meet us in his office at 7:15. I applied a final touch of makeup, secured my hair in its usual chignon, and tucked the USB drive containing my ownership documentation into an inside pocket of my handbag. As I descended the stairs of the home Richard and I had shared for 17 years, I realized I was viewing it differently already, assessing its value as an asset rather than feeling its emotional resonance as our home. Outside, Eleanor's black Audi waited in the circular driveway where I'd watched Richard drive away with Vanessa Porter just hours earlier. Eleanor sat behind the wheel, a leather portfolio on the passenger seat beside her, and a travel mug of coffee in the center console. "I brought you caffeine," she said as I slid into the seat beside her. "You look like you need it." "Thanks," I replied, taking the mug gratefully. "Did you get the information about Vanessa's finances?" Eleanor nodded, putting the car in drive. "Our investigation team worked through the night. Basic overview. She has approximately $1.2 million in investments, mostly tech stocks and some private equity. Condo in Tribeca with a $900,000 mortgage. No significant debt beyond that. She banks with First Manhattan." "Not with us?" I asked, surprised. "No, which is interesting considering how much business Richard brings to Northeastern. You'd think he'd have encouraged her to move her accounts." I considered this as we drove through the quiet Westchester streets toward Manhattan. He's keeping her finances separate deliberately, probably advised her to maintain distance from his financial institutions during the early stages of their relationship. Eleanor navigated onto the highway. "Smart from a legal perspective if he was planning to leave you. Harder to prove commingling of assets or financial relationships predating the separation." "Richard's always been strategic," I agreed, sipping the strong coffee. "What about her professional background? Beyond what I already know from business press coverage. Stanford MBA, as you knew. 5 years at Goldman Sachs in their tech investment division. Recruited to Grayson Halliday 8 months ago as head of strategic investments. Fast rise even by industry standards. She's 34. Almost 20 years younger than Richard," I noted. "Ambitious, clearly. Is there any indication she knew he was planning to leave his marriage when she took the position?" Eleanor shot me a quick glance before returning her eyes to the road. "Nothing concrete in her financial records, but there was a significant increase in her personal grooming expenses starting about 7 months ago. Regular appointments at Bergdorf's salon, new clothing purchases well above her previous spending patterns. Could be related to the new job, could be something else." 7 months, I repeated. "That tracks with when Richard began working late. More frequently." We fell silent as the Manhattan skyline came into view across the bridge. The financial district gleamed in the early morning light, glass towers reflecting the sunrise. Northeastern Regional's headquarters occupied a respectable, if not prominent, building on Wall Street. A 12-story structure with classic architectural details that spoke to the institution's 90-year history. "We should discuss our approach with Thomas," Eleanor said as we neared our exit. "He's fair-minded but cautious, and he genuinely respects Richard's business acumen." I nodded, gathering my thoughts. "I'll need to reveal my ownership position, but I want to do it in a way that doesn't create unnecessary tension with the board. This isn't about exercising control for its own sake." "What is it about, then?" Eleanor asked carefully. I considered the question seriously. The initial shock and anger at Richard's betrayal had crystallized overnight into something colder and more focused. This wasn't just about preventing him from cutting off my financial access, though that was certainly part of it. This was about something more fundamental. "Justice," I said finally, "and correcting a significant misperception about who I am and what I'm capable of." Eleanor smiled slightly as she pulled into the reserved parking space beneath the bank's headquarters. "I've been waiting years for Richard to discover exactly who he married. Today might finally be that day." We took the executive elevator directly to the top floor where Thomas Reynolds maintained a corner office with views of the harbor. His assistant, already at her desk despite the early hour, greeted Eleanor with professional warmth and me with polite surprise. "Mrs. Grayson, I didn't expect to see you this morning. Mr. Reynolds is waiting for you both." Thomas rose from behind his desk as we entered, a tall, trim man in his early 60s with a runner's build and the direct gaze of someone who preferred clarity to diplomacy. I'd met him numerous times at bank functions and charity events, always as Richard Grayson's wife. He'd been unfailingly polite, but never particularly interested in my opinions on banking or finance. "Eleanor, Amanda," he greeted us, gesturing to the seating area in the corner of his office rather than the more formal chairs in front of his desk. "This is an unexpected request. I understand there's something urgent we need to discuss before the board meeting?" Eleanor looked to me, yielding the floor. This was my revelation to make. "Yes, Thomas," I began, settling into one of the leather armchairs. "I'm afraid I need to disclose something that may be surprising and will certainly impact this morning's board agenda." His expression remained neutral, professional. "Go on." "I understand the emergency board meeting was called regarding account security protocols for the Grayson Holdings," I said. He nodded, a slight frown appearing. "That's correct, though I'm not sure how you would know that, as the agenda was only distributed to board members," Eleanor informed me, as she should have, given my position. I removed the USB drive from my handbag and placed it on the coffee table between us. "Thomas, I am the controlling partner of Prescott Heritage Trust and its subsidiary investment vehicles, which collectively hold 23% of Northeastern Regional's voting shares." For a moment, he stared at the small device as if it might be a practical joke, then his eyes moved to Eleanor, whose slight nod confirmed my statement. "That's not possible," he said finally. "The Prescott Heritage Trust is Margaret Prescott's investment vehicle." "Margaret and I are partners," I corrected gently. "She held the majority interest initially, but we structured a progressive ownership transfer that completed 3 years ago. I've maintained the same privacy measures she established for obvious reasons." Thomas leaned back in his chair, reassessing me entirely. "Why are you choosing to reveal this now?" I met his gaze directly. "Because my husband, Richard Grayson, left me yesterday evening and has frozen our joint accounts. I've learned he intends to use today's board meeting to secure additional restrictions on my financial access, likely claiming concerns about emotional decisions during our separation." Understanding dawned in Thomas's expression. "And you're here too." "I'm here to ensure the board understands certain realities before making decisions that affect my financial rights," I stated calmly. "I have no intention of creating corporate governance drama or using my position inappropriately. But I will not allow Richard to weaponize this institution against me based on a fundamental misunderstanding of who I am and what control I actually maintain." Thomas was silent for a long moment, processing the implications. Finally, he asked, "Does Richard know about your ownership position?" "No," I confirmed. "And that fact should make it clear how discreet I've been in exercising my influence. I've never used my position to advantage our joint finances or his business dealings. I've acted solely in the best interest of the institution." He nodded slowly, reaching for the USB drive. "May I?" "Please." It contains all the documentation verifying my ownership structure, the progressive transfer from Margaret, and the voting rights I control. Our legal team prepared a summary memo that addresses any governance questions this might raise. As Thomas reviewed the documents on his computer, Eleanor and I sat in silence. Finally, he turned back to us, his expression a mixture of respect and concern. "This is all in order," he acknowledged. "Perfectly legal and properly structured. I'm impressed, Amanda, and somewhat chagrined that none of us recognized what was happening right under our noses." "That was by design," I said simply. "What exactly are you asking for regarding today's meeting?" he asked, getting to the heart of the matter. I would Prefer to address the board myself at the appropriate moment, I replied. Not to create a dramatic scene, but to ensure there's no confusion about the actual balance of influence in the room. Richard needs to understand that financial coercion isn't an option. Thomas considered this request. The timing is challenging. Marcus has been quite insistent that this matter is urgent and requires immediate board action. I'm sure he has, I said, allowing a hint of steel to enter my voice. But perhaps you might suggest to Marcus before the meeting begins that proceeding cautiously would be advisable, given certain information that has come to your attention. That should buy us the time needed for proper disclosure. Thomas's expression suggested he was reassessing many previous interactions and decisions. I'll speak with Marcus privately before we convene, he agreed. And Amanda, I owe you an apology. I've clearly underestimated you in our previous interactions. I smiled slightly. You're in good company, Thomas. It's an error Richard has been making for 17 years. As we left his office to prepare for the 8 a.m. board meeting, I felt a curious lightness despite the circumstances. For years I had moved through two worlds simultaneously, the visible role of Richard Grayson's supportive wife and the invisible position of a financial strategist quietly amassing control of a significant banking institution. Today, those worlds would finally collide. Eleanor squeezed my arm as we walked toward the boardroom. Ready for this? I nodded, straightening my shoulders. More than ready. Richard always claimed I didn't understand his world. Time to show him exactly how well I understand it. Through the glass walls of the conference room, I could see board members beginning to arrive. Richard wasn't there yet. He liked to make entrances, to arrive just late enough to signal his time was valuable without being explicitly rude. Marcus Weldon was already present, speaking animatedly to two other board members, likely laying groundwork for whatever financial restrictions Richard had requested. In 10 minutes, Richard would walk through those doors expecting to find a room full of allies ready to help him control his soon-to-be ex-wife's access to funds. Instead, he would discover that the woman he'd dismissed as intellectually inferior controlled more voting power in his favorite financial institution than anyone else in the room. The board secretary approached, looking confused by my presence. Mrs. Grayson, I don't believe you're scheduled for today's meeting. Actually, I corrected him with a smile, I am. Thomas is expecting me. As if on cue, Thomas emerged from his office and approached us. Amanda will be joining us today, he informed the secretary. Please set a place for her at the table. Next to my position would be appropriate. The secretary's confusion deepened, but he nodded and moved to comply. Through the glass, I saw Marcus notice this exchange, his expression shifting from confidence to concern. He excused himself from his conversation and approached Thomas, glancing at me with barely concealed annoyance. Thomas, might I have a word before we begin? He asked, pointedly ignoring me. Of course, Marcus. Why don't we step into the side conference room? Amanda, Eleanor. Will just be a moment. As they disappeared into the adjacent room, Eleanor and I exchanged glances. Thomas is breaking the news to him, she murmured. This should be interesting. Through the glass partition, I could see Marcus's expression transform from irritation to disbelief to something approaching panic. He gestured emphatically, clearly arguing against whatever Thomas was explaining. Thomas remained calm, occasionally glancing down at his tablet where he had presumably loaded the documentation I'd provided. Finally, Marcus's shoulders slumped, slightly, the body language of a man recognizing he'd lost a significant advantage. As they returned to the boardroom, the elevator at the end of the hall chimed softly. Richard had arrived. He stepped into the hallway, impeccably dressed in one of his power suits, moving with the confident stride of someone who expected the world to yield to his presence. Then he saw me standing beside Eleanor outside the boardroom and faltered mid-step. The game was about to begin. For a moment, time seemed to suspend in the hallway outside the boardroom. Richard's stride faltered as recognition registered on his face followed immediately by confusion and then irritation. He quickened his pace, adjusting his expression to one of concerned professionalism as he approached. "Amanda," he said, his voice pitched low, "what are you doing here?" Before I could respond, the board secretary opened the boardroom door. "Mr. Grayson, we're ready to begin. The chairman has requested everyone take their seats." Richard glanced between me and the open doorway, clearly weighing his options. His training in managing awkward social situations won out. Scene-making before the board would damage the professional image he'd cultivated so carefully. "We'll discuss this inside," he said with a tight smile, gesturing for me to precede him into the room as if this had been a planned joint appearance. The boardroom fell silent as we entered. 10 board members, plus Thomas and Marcus, were already seated around the polished mahogany table. Several shot questioning glances at each other as Richard and I walked in together. The seating arrangement told its own story. Thomas at the head of the table, with places set for me and Eleanor to his right, leaving Richard to take the vacant seat next to Marcus on the opposite side. "Good morning, everyone," Thomas began once we were settled. "We have several items to address this morning, but before we turn to the agenda, I need to inform the board of a significant disclosure that will impact our discussions." Richard's eyes narrowed slightly as he assessed the room, sensing the shift in dynamics. His gaze settled on me, calculating. "As some of you know," Thomas continued, "Prescott Heritage Trust controls approximately 23% of Northeastern Regional's voting shares, making it our largest single shareholder. What has not been widely known until now is that the controlling partner of that trust is Amanda Grayson." The room went utterly still. I kept my eyes on Thomas, aware that every person at the table had turned to stare at me, but I refused to look at Richard. Not yet. I needed to hold my composure through this disclosure. "Amanda has provided comprehensive documentation verifying her position," Thomas added, "which our legal team is reviewing, but initial assessment confirms its validity. In the interest of full transparency before we proceed with today's agenda items, I felt it important to ensure all board members are operating with complete information." Now I allowed myself to meet Richard's gaze. His face had drained of color, and for perhaps the first time in our relationship, I saw him completely blindsided. The confident mask he presented to the world had slipped, revealing genuine shock underneath. Marcus leaned over to whisper something to Richard, who shook his head slightly, eyes still fixed on me. "Given this development," Thomas continued smoothly, "I recommend we modify today's agenda. The matter regarding Grayson Holdings account protocols should perhaps be addressed separately, after appropriate legal consultation." Richard finally found his voice. "I believe that matter is still relevant and urgent," he countered, visibly working to regain his composure. "My wife's—" He paused, correcting himself. "Amanda's ownership position doesn't change the legitimate security concerns I've raised." Thomas nodded diplomatically. "We'll certainly address those concerns, Richard. But I think we can all agree the context has shifted significantly. Perhaps you might outline the general nature of those concerns for the board's consideration, with the understanding that any action would follow proper governance protocols." It was a masterful redirection, acknowledging Richard's concerns while removing any possibility of immediate action. Richard recognized the maneuver for what it was, his jaw tightening momentarily before he adopted a look of reasonable consideration. "Of course," he agreed, shuffling the papers before him. "As I communicated to Marcus yesterday, Amanda and I are beginning divorce proceedings. Given the sensitive nature of high asset separations, my legal counsel advised securing certain joint holdings against impulsive liquidation during what is clearly an emotional time for both parties." The condescension in his tone made my fingers tighten around my pen, but I kept my face neutral. Let him continue digging his own grave with these people who now understood I controlled more of their bank than anyone in the room. "I requested this meeting," Richard continued, to ensure the bank implemented appropriate security protocols on our joint accounts and investment holdings. However, in light of this surprising disclosure, I recognize more extensive legal review may be needed. Eleanor spoke up, her tone professionally detached. To clarify, Richard, what specific restrictions were you hoping to implement on Mrs. Grayson's financial access? Richard's eyes narrowed at Eleanor's deliberate use of my title. He'd clearly expected her to side with him as a bank executive. Standard protective measures, he replied carefully. Dual authorization requirements for transactions above a certain threshold. Temporary holds on investment liquidations. Notification. Protocols for unusual account activity. Basic security measures. Nothing punitive. Nothing punitive, I repeated, speaking for the first time since entering the boardroom. Like reducing my access to a $3,000 monthly allowance for household necessities after 17 years of marriage? A murmur rippled around the table. Richard's expression flickered between embarrassment and anger before settling into practiced concern. That's a temporary household account established yesterday to ensure continuity while we sort out longer-term arrangements, he explained to the room, adopting the tone he used when simplifying complex concepts for clients. Amanda's characterization is emotionally understandable but not factually accurate. I have the account documentation with me, I replied calmly, removing the envelope from my bag and sliding it to Thomas. I'm happy to share the exact language Richard used regarding my financial access. Thomas glanced at the document briefly before returning it. I think we've established that there are contested perspectives here that require proper legal channels, not emergency board action. He directed his next comment to Richard. Given Amanda's disclosure of her ownership position, I believe the appropriate next step is for both parties to have their legal representatives coordinate with our compliance department on any account modifications. The discussion continued, with other board matters eventually taking precedence. Richard participated minimally, his attention clearly divided between the agenda items and the bombshell of my ownership revelation. I maintained professional engagement throughout, contributing to conversations about quarterly projections and branch expansion plans as if this were any normal board meeting, as if my marriage hadn't imploded less than 24 hours earlier. 2 hours later, as the meeting concluded, board members filed out with curious glances at both Richard and me. Several stopped to speak with me directly, suddenly discovering an interest in my opinions about banking matters that had never previously existed. Thomas asked Eleanor and me to remain behind, along with Richard and Marcus. When the door closed, behind the last departing board member, Richard finally dropped his professional facade. 17 years, he said, his voice quiet but intense. 17 years of marriage, and you never once mentioned owning a controlling interest in Northeastern Regional. You never asked, I replied simply. That's absurd. This isn't about me failing to ask the right question. This is about you deliberately concealing a massive financial position. Like you concealed your relationship with Vanessa Porter while planning your exit strategy from our marriage, I countered. Marcus shifted uncomfortably. Perhaps this conversation should happen privately. Thomas, if we could use your office? No, I interrupted firmly. This conversation happens here with witnesses. Richard came to this meeting intending to restrict my financial access without my knowledge or consent. That fact should be acknowledged before we proceed. Thomas cleared his throat. Amanda's right. We need clarity on what was being proposed and what happens now. He turned to Richard. What exactly were you planning to tell the board today? Richard straightened his tie, regrouping. I was going to request standard security protocols for high-value joint accounts during separation proceedings. Nothing unusual or inappropriate. He asked Marcus to freeze all our joint holdings and remove my independent access to any account associated with Grayson assets, I corrected, looking directly at Marcus, whose discomfort visibly increased, including the trust account that pays for my mother's medical care. Isn't that right, Marcus? Marcus glanced at Richard, then back at me. Richard expressed concerns about account security during an emotional separation, he said carefully. We discussed various protective measures, which you were prepared to implement without so much as a phone call to me, I noted. Despite my 15-year history with this bank and my position on the Middleton Foundation Board, which has maintained significant deposits with Northeastern for over a decade. Thomas intervened before Marcus could respond. The point is moot now. No account restrictions will be implemented without dual consent or appropriate legal orders. Richard, I suggest you consult with your attorney about the implications of Amanda's ownership position on your separation strategy. Richard's expression had shifted from shock to calculation. I recognized the look. He was already reassessing the situation, identifying leverage points, formulating a revised approach. This changes nothing about our separation, he said finally. It merely complicates the financial arrangements temporarily. It changes everything, I countered. It changes the fundamental power dynamic you assumed would define this divorce. It changes your ability to control the narrative with our social circle and business associates. Most importantly, it changes your assumption that I'm the intellectual inferior in this marriage. Eleanor touched my arm gently, a warning not to let emotion overtake strategy. She was right. This wasn't the time or place for the full reckoning. That would eventually come. I think we're finished here for today, Thomas said, standing. Eleanor, please ensure our compliance team understands no changes are to be made to any Grayson-associated accounts without dual authorization or court order. As the meeting broke up, Richard caught my arm at the door. We need to talk privately, he said, his voice low and urgent. Not today, I replied, disengaging from his grip. I'll have my attorney contact yours tomorrow. Amanda? He persisted. Be reasonable. We should discuss this like adults, not through lawyers. The condescension in his tone renewed my anger. Like adults? You left divorce papers with a $3,000 allowance on our dresser after 17 years of marriage. You conspired with Marcus to freeze my assets without warning. At what point in that process were you being an adult? His jaw tightened. That's not a fair characterization. Save it for your attorney. I cut him off. And Richard, you might want to ask Vanessa what bank she uses. First Manhattan, isn't it? Interesting choice when you've had so much influence at Northeastern all these years. The flash of surprise in his eyes confirmed Eleanor's intelligence was accurate. He hadn't expected me to know anything about Vanessa's finances. How did you... he began, then stopped himself. This is exactly the emotional reaction I was concerned about. Investigating my personal relationships, making accusations. Not accusations, Richard. Observations. There's a difference. I stepped away from him. Eleanor, are you ready? She nodded, and we left Richard standing in the boardroom doorway, his carefully constructed narrative of our separation already unraveling around him. In the elevator descending to the lobby, Eleanor finally let out a low whistle. That was something to witness. I don't think I've ever seen Richard speechless before. He won't stay that way for long, I replied, the adrenaline of the confrontation beginning to ebb. He's already recalculating. By this afternoon, he'll have a revised strategy. Eleanor studied my face. How are you really doing? That was intense. In there, but you held it together beautifully. The elevator doors opened to the marble-floored lobby, and we stepped out among the morning crowd of banking customers and employees. For a moment, I couldn't answer her question. How was I doing? The professional composure I'd maintained throughout the meeting was starting to crack, revealing the raw emotions underneath. I don't know, I admitted as we pushed through the revolving doors into the crisp October morning. I haven't really processed anything yet. It's all been strategy and countermoves since he walked out. Eleanor hailed a taxi. Come stay with me for a few days. That house has too many memories, and Richard still has keys. I nodded. suddenly exhausted. I need to pack some things first and call my attorney. I'll come with you, she insisted. You shouldn't be alone in that house right now. The taxi ride back to Westchester passed in silence. The morning's victory, stopping Richard's financial maneuver and revealing my ownership position, had consumed all my focus. Now, as we approached, the house Richard and I had shared for so many years, the emotional reality of our separation began to sink in more deeply. The marriage I had believed in was over. The partner I had supported through career transitions, family crises, and health scares had been planning his exit while I sat at my mother's hospital bedside during her last Parkinson's treatment. The man who had once quoted poetry to me across candlelit dinner tables had reduced my worth to a $3,000 monthly allowance. As Eleanor paid the taxi driver, I stood in the driveway looking at our home with new eyes, assessing it as property rather than sanctuary. The Victorian architecture that had charmed us, the gardens I had carefully cultivated, the wraparound porch where we'd spent summer evenings discussing books and dreams, all of it suddenly felt like the elaborate set of a play that had finished its run. You okay? Eleanor asked, joining me on the walkway. No, I answered honestly, but I will be. Inside, the house felt different, emptier despite minimal physical changes. Richard's absence was palpable in ways I hadn't noticed during the shock of the previous night. His favorite throw blanket missing from the living room sofa. The space on the hallway shelf where his collection of first editions had been discreetly removed. The lingering scent of his cologne in the study, already fading. I moved through the rooms mechanically, gathering essentials for a few days away. Clothes, toiletries, medications, important documents. Eleanor followed, offering quiet support without intrusive questions. As I packed, my phone buzzed repeatedly with texts and calls from Richard, which I ignored. Whatever recalibrated approach he was formulating could wait until I had steadier, emotional footing. In our bedroom, I paused before the large framed photo on the wall from our 10th anniversary trip to Tuscany. Richard and I stood among vineyards, his arm around my waist, both of us smiling into the camera with the golden Italian countryside stretching behind us. We looked happy. We had been happy, I thought. Or at least, I had been. Had he been planning? This even then? I wondered aloud. Looking for his exit while pretending to celebrate our marriage? Eleanor glanced up from folding a sweater I'd handed her. I don't think so. Men like Richard don't usually plan that far ahead with relationships. They rewrite history afterward to justify their choices. You sound like you speak from experience, I observed. She smiled grimly. My ex-husband followed the same playbook. One day we were discussing retirement plans. The next he was telling me he'd been unhappy for years and had finally found his soulmate in his 28-year-old administrative assistant. I sat heavily on the edge of the bed. What happens now, Elle? Practically speaking, what does tomorrow look like? And the day after? And the day after that? Eleanor abandoned the packing to sit beside me. One step at a time. You secure your financial position. You find your emotional footing. You decide what you want from the divorce and what you're willing to concede. You rebuild. I've been Richard Grayson's wife for so long, I said quietly. Even while secretly building my position at the bank, I was still defining myself partly through his reflection. That ends now, Eleanor said firmly. Today in that boardroom, you weren't Richard's wife. You were Amanda Grayson, controlling shareholder of a major regional bank, outmaneuvering one of New York's most celebrated financial strategists at his own game. My phone buzzed again. Richard's 6th call in the past hour. This time I picked up. Yes, I answered coolly. Amanda, we need to talk. His voice came through, controlled but urgent. There are aspects of the situation you don't fully understand. I understand perfectly, I countered. You left me, froze our accounts, and attempted to use your banking connections to financially hamstring me during divorce proceedings. What part am I missing? He sighed. the sound crackling through the speaker. This doesn't have to be contentious. Your revelation this morning was surprising, but it doesn't change the fact that our marriage has run its course. We can still handle this like reasonable people. Reasonable people, I repeated. Like you were being reasonable when you left divorce papers on our dresser? Or when you instructed Marcus to implement emergency protocols on our accounts? That's not, he began, then stopped himself. When he continued, his tone had shifted to one I recognized from difficult client negotiations, conciliatory but firm. I made mistakes in how I handled things. I acknowledge that. But escalating this into financial warfare benefits neither of us. I haven't escalated anything, I replied. I merely revealed information you should have known about your wife of 17 years, had you ever bothered to see me as more than an appendage to your career. Silence stretched between us for several seconds. Finally, Richard spoke again, his voice lower. I never saw you that way, Amanda. Save the revisionist history, Richard. Your actions speak for themselves. I glanced at Eleanor, who gave me an encouraging nod. My attorney will contact you tomorrow. Until then, I have nothing more to say to you. I ended the call before he could respond, then turned my phone off completely. The emotional armor I'd maintained all morning was cracking, and I didn't want Richard to hear the breakdown that felt increasingly imminent. Eleanor finished packing my bag while I sat motionless on the bed, staring at the now dark phone in my hand. The professional victory at the board meeting had temporarily overshadowed the personal devastation of Richard's betrayal, but now the grief was rushing in, threatening to overwhelm my carefully constructed composure. I think that's everything essential, Eleanor said gently. We can come back for anything else you need later. I nodded, standing mechanically. As we descended the stairs, a memory ambushed me. Richard carrying me up these same steps the day. We moved in, both of us laughing as he pretended to stumble at the top. Careful, I'd teased. Don't drop your most valuable asset. He'd kissed me then, deeply and without reservation. My only truly valuable asset, he'd corrected. The contradiction between that memory and yesterday's callous departure hit me with physical force. I stumbled on the bottom step, and Eleanor caught my arm to steady me. Amanda? She asked, concern evident in her voice. The tears I'd been suppressing since Richard walked out finally broke through. Not dignified, silent tears, but racking sobs that bent me double in the foyer of the home where I'd believed myself loved and valued for nearly 2 decades. Eleanor set down my bag and wrapped her arms around me, saying nothing, simply holding. Mia's 17 years of partnership collapsed into grief in the space of a breath. I don't understand, I managed between sobs. How do you share a life with someone for that long and not see them leaving? How do you miss the signs? You didn't miss anything, Eleanor said firmly. Richard did what men like him always do, compartmentalized. Perfectly until the moment he was ready to act. There weren't signs, because he didn't allow them to exist. Eventually, the storm of emotion subsided enough for me to straighten up, wiping my face with shaking hands. I'm sorry. Don't you dare apologize, Eleanor interrupted. Your marriage ended yesterday. You're entitled to fall apart a little. I drew a deep, steadying breath. Not for long, though. Richard's regrouping as we speak, and I need to be prepared for whatever comes next. Eleanor picked up my bag again. One step at a time. First step, get you away from this house and somewhere you can breathe. As we walked toward her car, I glanced. Back at the Victorian home Richard and I had lovingly restored together. The grief was real and would need to be processed. But alongside it, something else was crystallizing. A cold, clear determination that Richard would not dictate the terms of our separation any more than he had dictated the terms of my financial access. He had dismissed me as an intellectual inferior, incapable of understanding his world. He had reduced 17 years of partnership to a $3,000 monthly allowance. He had assumed I would accept whatever settlement he deemed fair out of emotional exhaustion and financial vulnerability. He had underestimated me for the last time. In Eleanor's car, heading back toward Manhattan, I finally turned my phone back on. 12 missed calls from Richard, 3 voicemails, 22 text messages. I ignored them all and instead called my attorney. "James," I said when he answered, "I need you to clear your schedule. It's time to activate the contingency plan we discussed." Eleanor glanced at me from the driver's seat, eyebrow raised in question. "Yes, full implementation," I continued to James. "And I need you to coordinate with Margaret Prescott's team immediately. She'll want to be informed of developments." After ending the call, I sat silently for several minutes, watching the familiar landscape of my life for the past 17 years recede in the rearview mirror. "Full implementation?" Eleanor finally asked. "Should I be concerned about what you're planning?" I met her gaze steadily. "Not concerned, but perhaps prepared. Richard isn't the only one who knows how to plan an exit strategy." As we crossed the bridge back into Manhattan, I felt the first stirrings of something beyond grief and shock, a sense of possibility I hadn't experienced in years. Richard's betrayal had shattered the life I thought I had, but in doing so, it had created space for something entirely new. What that would be, I didn't yet know. But I was certain of one thing: it would be built on my terms, not his. Eleanor's Manhattan apartment occupied the top floor of a pre-war building in Gramercy Park, a space that reflected her personality. Elegant but practical, with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, comfortable furniture, and stunning views of the city through large windows. It felt like a sanctuary after the emotional turbulence of the past 24 hours. "Guest room's all yours," she said, depositing my bag in a tastefully decorated bedroom. "I'll make us some lunch while you settle in." Alone in the quiet room, I sank onto the edge of the bed, suddenly exhausted. The adrenaline that had carried me through the board meeting and the subsequent emotional breakdown at the house had dissipated, leaving bone-deep weariness in its wake. I wanted nothing more than to curl up and sleep for days, but there was too much at stake. Richard would be mobilizing his resources, consulting with attorneys, recalibrating his approach. I needed to be equally prepared. My phone buzzed with an incoming call. James Harrington, my attorney. "Amanda," he greeted me, his voice carrying its usual calm authority. "I've reviewed the documentation from this morning's meeting. Quite the revelation you made." "It seemed the appropriate moment," I replied. "Richard left me little choice." "Indeed. I've already spoken with Margaret Prescott. She sends her regards and says, and I quote, 'It's about time Richard learned who he really married.'" That drew a small smile from me. Margaret had never particularly cared for Richard, finding him conventionally intelligent but lacking imagination. One of her more charitable assessments. "What's our next step?" I asked, steering the conversation toward practicalities. "I've initiated contact with Richard's attorney, Benjamin Caldwell. You know him, I believe?" "Yes," I confirmed. "He's handled Richard's business affairs for years." Benjamin was cut from the same cloth as Richard. Harvard law, old money connections, and a reputation for aggressive representation of high-net-worth clients. "I've requested a comprehensive financial disclosure," James continued. "Given the circumstances of your separation and Richard's immediate moves to restrict your access, I've indicated we'll be seeking expedited court intervention if necessary." How did Caldwell respond? With predictable bluster. He suggested Richard's actions were standard protocol for high-asset divorces and implied your banking position constituted a conflict of interest that might necessitate regulatory review. I sighed, unsurprised. So Richard's already spinning this as me abusing my secret power position. Unsuccessfully, James assured me. I reminded Caldwell that you've held your ownership stake for 7 years without any governance issues, while Richard's attempt to freeze your assets occurred immediately upon deciding to leave the marriage. What about the house? I asked, thinking of the Victorian home that suddenly felt more like a museum of a failed relationship than a place I wanted to return to. For now, I recommend you stay elsewhere, but don't formally vacate. Richard's departure and removal of personal items establishes his intent to leave the marital home, which gives us certain strategic advantages. Eleanor appeared in the doorway with a mug of tea. Lunch is almost ready, she mouthed silently. Nodded my thanks. James, what about Richard's relationship with Vanessa Porter? Do we have concrete evidence of when it began? We're gathering information, he replied carefully. If we can establish the relationship that predates his decision to leave, it strengthens certain aspects of our position. I need to know exactly what I'm dealing with, I said firmly. Full background on Vanessa, timeline of their relationship, and any financial entanglements that might already exist between them. I've engaged the investigative team. They'll be discreet but thorough. James paused. Amanda, there's something else you should be prepared for. The banking revelations will likely attract business press attention. Richard's position at Grayson, Halliday, combined with your previously undisclosed ownership of Northeastern Regional, makes for compelling financial news. I hadn't considered the publicity angle, but he was right. The financial press would find the story irresistible. A high-profile venture capitalist blindsided by his wife's secret control of his banking institution. How do we manage that? I asked. Proactively, James advised. We craft the narrative before someone else does. Margaret has suggested her PR team coordinate with you on a statement if the story breaks. After finishing the call with James, I joined Eleanor in her sun-filled kitchen where she'd prepared a simple lunch of soup and sandwiches. I explained the potential for press coverage. It was bound to happen, Eleanor said, setting a bowl in front of me. The financial world loves nothing more than a powerful man caught off guard. Add in the personal drama, and it's catnip for journalists. I've spent 17 years avoiding public attention, I said, stirring the soup absently. Richard was always the one seeking the spotlight. Which makes this role reversal all the more significant, Eleanor pointed out. You're no longer in his shadow. That's going to be a difficult adjustment for him. My phone buzzed with a text from Richard. We need to talk before this escalated further. Meet me for dinner tonight. The Pierre, 7 p.m. I showed Eleanor the message. He's trying to re-establish control, she observed. Private dinner at a neutral location where he can charm you or intimidate you, depending on which tactic he thinks will work better. I'm not ready to face him one-on-one, I admitted. Not until I have a clearer understanding of what I'm dealing with and what I want from this situation. Then don't, Eleanor said simply. You don't owe him an immediate response to anything. I typed a brief reply. Not available. All communication through attorneys for now. His response came seconds later. That's unnecessary and will only complicate matters. We're both adults, Amanda. We can discuss this reasonably. I turned my phone, face down on the table without responding. The familiar pattern was emerging, Richard positioning himself as the reasonable party while subtly suggesting I was being emotional or difficult. It had been an effective tactic during disagreements throughout our marriage, making me question my own reactions. Not anymore. I need to understand exactly what we're dealing with financially, I said to Eleanor. What assets are truly joint? What's in Richard's name alone? What might be hidden? Eleanor nodded. I'll have our financial intelligence team pull together a comprehensive profile. Given Richard's position at Grayson Halliday, most of his significant assets would be documented through various regulatory filings and tax records. Focus particularly on any unusual transfers or account activity in the past 6 months, I suggested. If he's been planning this exit, he may have been positioning assets already. What about your mother's care? Eleanor asked gently. You mentioned her treatments are paid from a joint account. The question highlighted an immediate practical concern. My mother's advanced Parkinson's required specialized care and treatments not fully covered by insurance. The monthly costs were substantial. I need to establish a separate account and payment system immediately, I acknowledged. Richard claimed he would ensure those payments continued, but I can't rely on his word. We can set that up today, Eleanor assured me. I'll have someone from private banking come here this afternoon. We'll create an account under your sole control and arrange for all medical payments to transition seamlessly. As Eleanor made the necessary calls, I found myself staring out at the Manhattan skyline trying to organize my thoughts. The immediate financial concerns were being addressed, but the larger questions loomed. What did I actually want from this divorce? What kind of life was I building toward? For so many years, my identity had been intertwined with Richard's, not just socially as his wife, but in the carefully constructed narrative we presented to the world. Even my secret acquisition of Northeastern Regional shares had been partly defined by its relationship to Richard's business world, a silent checkmate I never expected to actually deploy. Now that I had deployed it, what came next? Eleanor's private banking representative arrived at 2 o'clock, a discreet, efficient woman named Stephanie, who set up a new account structure that would ensure my mother's care continued uninterrupted. She also provided a comprehensive overview of banking resources available to me as a high-net-worth client, separate from any joint accounts with Richard. We can establish complete financial independence within days, Stephanie explained. New credit cards, investment accounts, property, title reviews, whatever you need to separate your financial identity from your husband's. After she left, my phone buzzed with an email notification from James. The subject line read, "Preliminary Financial Assessment, Confidential." The attached document outlined what James's team had already assembled regarding Richard's and my financial position. The numbers were staggering, even though I'd been generally aware of our wealth. Richard's partnership stake in Grayson Halliday alone was valued at approximately $32 million. Our investment portfolio, mostly in joint names, totaled nearly $18 million. The Westchester house had a current market value of $5.2 million with no mortgage. Various other properties, vehicles, art collections, and retirement accounts added several million more to the total. More interesting were the recent transactions James had flagged for further investigation. 3 months ago, Richard had established a new LLC called Momentum Ventures, transferring $2.1 million from our joint investment account to its corporate accounts. The stated purpose was private equity investments in emerging technologies, but no specific investments had yet been made. The timing correlated with when, in retrospect, I realized Richard had begun working late more frequently and traveling more often for client meetings. Eleanor, I called, showing her the document when she came in from her home office. What do you make of this Momentum Ventures entity? She scanned the information, her expression growing troubled. The structure is unusual for a legitimate investment vehicle. Multiple shell companies, offshore banking connections. This looks designed to obscure ownership and movements of funds. You think he's hiding assets, I stated. I think he's attempting to, she corrected. But Richard's not as clever as he believes himself to be. These types of structures leave paper trails. With your resources and the right forensic accountants, we can trace everything. I absorbed this information. The hurt of betrayal giving way to cold anger. Richard hadn't just planned to leave me. He'd been systematically positioning assets beyond my reach while we still shared dinners, attended events together, and slept in the same bed. We need to talk to Margaret, I decided. She's dealt with financial deception before? Eleanor nodded, already reaching for her phone. I'll see if she's available for dinner tonight. Margaret Prescott agreed to join us at her private club at 7. Ironically, the same time Richard had suggested for our dinner meeting at the Pierre. Her driver collected us from Eleanor's apartment, delivering us to a discreet townhouse on the Upper East Side that housed one of New York's oldest and most exclusive private clubs. At 72, Margaret remained an imposing presence. Tall and straight-backed, with silver hair cut in a stylish bob and the sharp gaze of someone who missed nothing. She greeted me with a warm embrace, an unusual display from a woman known for her reserve. "Amanda, my dear," she said, studying my face intently. "You're holding up remarkably well under the circumstances." "I'm operating on autopilot," I admitted, as a club attendant led us to a private dining room. The shock is still cushioning the reality. Once we were seated with drinks, scotch for Margaret and Eleanor, sparkling water for me, Margaret got straight to business. James briefed me on the situation. "Richard is behaving exactly as one would expect from a man of his particular limitations," she said dismissively. "The question now is how you want to proceed. What outcome are you seeking?" The directness of her question caught me off guard. "I haven't had time to think that far ahead," I admitted. "I've been focused on immediate financial security and understanding what we're dealing with." Margaret nodded approvingly. "Sensible approach, but now we must think longer term. This goes beyond merely securing a fair divorce settlement. Richard's actions, the financial restrictions, the apparent asset concealment, suggest he believed you would be operating from a position of weakness. Now that he knows about your northeastern regional position, he'll adjust his strategy, but his fundamental assumption about your capabilities won't change." "You think he still underestimates me?" I observed. "I know he does," Margaret replied firmly. "Men like Richard can acknowledge being temporarily outmaneuvered, but they cannot accept being genuinely outmatched, particularly by their wives. He's already constructing a narrative where your banking position is either a fluke or something orchestrated by others on your behalf." Eleanor nodded in agreement. "The bank gossip mill is already active. Marcus has been suggesting to board members that your acquisition was primarily Margaret's doing, with you as a figurehead. The assessment stung because it contained a kernel of truth. Margaret had initiated the Northeastern Regional acquisition, bringing me in as her partner. But the strategy we'd implemented over 7 years, the gradual expansion of our position, the governance improvements we'd quietly influenced, the digital banking initiatives we'd championed through proxies, had been a true collaboration. "So, what's your recommendation?" I asked Margaret. She sipped her scotch thoughtfully. "Don't just secure a fair settlement. Use this opportunity to establish your independent identity in the financial world. Richard has defined you as an accessory to his success for 17 years. Now you can redefine yourself on your own terms." "That's easier said than done," I pointed out. "The financial world is still an old boys' club in many ways." "Which is precisely why it needs disruption," Margaret countered. "Northeastern Regional's digital banking initiatives have been moderately successful, but they've barely scratched the surface of what's possible. You have a platform. Use it." As we continued discussing strategy over dinner, a clearer picture began forming in my mind. This divorce wasn't just about dividing assets or ensuring financial security. It was about claiming an identity I'd allowed to remain partially submerged during my marriage. "I need a comprehensive assessment of Grace and Halliday's business entanglements with Northeastern Regional," I said as the main course arrived. "Any loans, lines of credit, client relationships that might give us leverage." Eleanor nodded. "I'll have our relationship management team pull together a complete profile. Discreetly, of course. Also," I continued, "I want to understand Vanessa Porter's professional history more thoroughly. Her move to Grace and Halliday 8 months ago seems suspiciously timed in retrospect. You think Richard brought her in specifically because they were already involved?" Margaret asked. "I don't know," I admitted. "But it would explain certain shifts in his behavior around that time. He suddenly became intensely focused on the firm's new direction and innovative investment strategies, terms he'd never particularly emphasized before." Margaret's expression sharpened with interest. "If he hired her because of their personal relationship, that creates potential liability issues for Grace and Halliday. Conflict of interest, improper hiring practices, particularly if other candidates were passed over." "The board would be concerned," Eleanor agreed. especially given the firm's institutional investor base. Pension funds and endowments don't appreciate that kind of reputational risk. The conversation continued, building a detailed assessment of our strategic position. By dessert, we had outlined a comprehensive approach that extended well beyond the immediate divorce proceedings. "I have a car waiting to take you to the Four Seasons," Margaret informed me as we prepared to leave. "I've arranged a suite there for as long as you need it. The Westchester house holds too many memories, and while Eleanor's hospitality is commendable, you need a neutral space to plan your next moves." I started to protest, but Margaret waved away my objections. "Consider it an investment in your future, independence. Besides, the Four Seasons offers better security, which you may need if the press gets wind of this situation." Outside the club, Margaret took my hands in hers, her grip surprisingly strong for her age. "Amanda, remember something important. Richard selected you all those years ago because he recognized your intelligence and capabilities, even if he later chose to downplay them. You've always been exceptional. You simply allowed your light to be dimmed in service to his ambitions." The validation from this formidable woman brought unexpected tears to my eyes. "Thank you, Margaret, for everything." "Don't thank me yet," she replied with a small smile. "Thank me when Richard fully understands the consequences of his miscalculation." In the car headed toward the Four Seasons, I checked my phone for the first time in hours. 6 missed calls from Richard. A dozen text messages, growing increasingly frustrated with my lack of response. One voicemail, which I played on speaker so Eleanor could hear. "Amanda, this silent treatment is childish and counterproductive." Richard's voice came through, tightly controlled but with evident irritation. "I've been more than reasonable under the circumstances. I understand you're upset about the separation, but this financial gamesmanship will only damage both our interests. Call me back immediately so we can discuss a sensible path forward." Eleanor rolled her eyes, still trying to control the narrative, still positioning himself as the reasonable adult in the room. "Still underestimating me," I added, deleting the voicemail without responding. At the Four Seasons, the suite Margaret had arranged was spacious and elegant. A full living room, dining area, luxurious bedroom, and marble bathroom larger than some Manhattan apartments. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered spectacular views of the city lights, a glittering backdrop that emphasized how dramatically my life had changed in just 24 hours. Eleanor helped me settle in, promising to return in the morning with updates, from the bank's investigation into Grayson Halliday's business connections. After she left, I stood at the windows watching the city below. Somewhere out there, Richard was likely pacing in his own hotel room, or perhaps Vanessa's Tribeca condo, frustrated by my refusal to engage on his terms, already drafting new approaches with his legal team. Let him plan. Let him strategize. Let him continue believing this was a simple matter of financial negotiations that he, as the superior strategist, would ultimately control. For 17 years, Richard had seen what he expected to see: a supportive wife who managed his social calendar and organized his charity events, an intelligent woman whose capabilities were nevertheless subordinate to his own. He had never truly seen me. Now he would have no choice. My phone buzzed with a text from James. "Caldwell requesting an urgent meeting tomorrow. Says Richard prepared to make a generous settlement offer if we suspend investigation into Momentum Ventures." I smiled slightly at the transparency of Richard's maneuver. The mention of Momentum Ventures had clearly rattled him, as well it should. Whatever he was hiding there represented a vulnerability he hadn't expected me to discover so quickly. "Decline meeting," I texted back. "Inform Caldwell all financial investigations will continue as standard protocol during divorce proceedings." Setting. Down my phone, I moved away from the window and settled at the suite's elegant desk. Opening my laptop, I began a document titled Strategic Assessment, creating a detailed inventory of assets, vulnerabilities, leverage points, and objectives. By the time I finished 3 hours later, I had a comprehensive roadmap for the weeks ahead. This wasn't just about securing a fair division of assets or exposing Richard's financial maneuvers. This was about reclaiming my identity and establishing my position in the financial world he thought belonged exclusively to men like him. Richard had tried to cut me off financially, not knowing I owned his bank. That initial miscalculation had opened the door to something much larger than either of us had anticipated. He had dismissed me as intellectually inferior, incapable of understanding his world. Now I would show him just how profound his misunderstanding had been. Before going to bed, I sent a brief message to Margaret. Strategic assessment complete. Ready to proceed. Her response came moments later. Excellent. Remember, in chess, the queen is the most powerful piece on the board. Richard has just discovered he's been playing against a grandmaster. I awoke the next morning to an urgent call from James Harrington. The digital clock on the bedside table read 6:17 a.m. Amanda, I apologize for the early hour, James began, his normally composed voice tense. But there's been a development you need to be aware of immediately. The Wall Street Journal is running a story in today's edition about your Northeastern regional ownership position and the confrontation with Richard at the board meeting. I sat up, instantly alert. How? That meeting was less than 48 hours ago. Someone talked, James replied grimly. The article quotes an unnamed board member describing the dramatic revelation of your controlling interest and Richard's visible shock upon learning his wife secretly controlled his banking relationships. How bad is it? I asked, already moving toward the suite's living room where I could access my laptop. Mixed. The headline isn't subtle. Venture capital powerhouse blindsided. Wife's secret bank takeover upends high-profile divorce. But the content is more nuanced than I expected. They've positioned it primarily as a business story about governance and disclosure rather than marital drama. I opened my laptop and quickly found the article. The byline belonged to Catherine Mercer, one of the Journal's most respected financial journalists. As James had indicated, the piece took a surprisingly balanced approach, noting that my 7-year ownership position had coincided with Northeastern Regional's notable improvements in governance practices and digital banking initiatives. It included quotes from banking analysts suggesting the bank's performance had strengthened during this period. The personal aspects were handled with relative restraint, though the article did note Richard's apparent attempt to restrict his wife's financial access coincided with his departure from their 17-year marriage, citing anonymous sources familiar with the situation. Who leaked this? I asked, scrolling through the detailed reporting. It's too specific to be general gossip. My money's on Marcus, James replied. The quotes about the board meeting have his particular blend of self-importance and dramatization. He likely thought spinning this early would help Richard's position. Before I could respond, another call came through. Eleanor. James, let me call you back, I said, switching lines. Eleanor, I'm guessing you've seen the Journal article? Seen it? I'm dealing with the fallout already, she replied, sounding harried. 3 major institutional clients have called with governance concerns. Thomas has scheduled an emergency executive committee meeting for 8 a.m., and Catherine Mercer is camping out in our lobby, hoping for a comment from you or any other bank executive. Who told her about the board meeting? I asked, though I already suspected the answer. Marcus, almost certainly. He's been in damage control mode since you left yesterday, trying to position himself as caught between Richard's requests and proper banking protocols. The article makes him sound like he was protecting the bank's integrity. I sighed, unsurprised but disappointed. What's Thomas's position? Professional but concerned. The publicity creates complications for client relationships and regulatory oversight. He's requested you join the executive committee meeting, virtually if possible. He understands coming to the bank might create a media situation. I'll be there virtually, I promised. And Eleanor, thank you for managing this. After ending the call, I ordered coffee from room service and took a quick shower, mentally preparing for the meeting ahead. The journal article complicated matters significantly. What had been a private confrontation was now public knowledge, creating potential issues for both Northeastern Regional and my longer-term strategy regarding Richard. My phone buzzed with a text from Richard. "I assume you've seen the article. This public spectacle helps neither of us. We need to present a united front to control the narrative. Call me ASAP." I deleted the message without responding. Richard was scrambling to regain control, to position us as equals managing a private matter that had unfortunately become public. His request for a united front was transparently self-serving. He wanted to contain the reputational damage to his carefully cultivated image as a financial mastermind. At precisely 8 a.m., I connected to the executive committee meeting via secure video link. The participants were already assembled in the boardroom: Thomas, Eleanor, Marcus, and 3 other executive team members. Thomas's expression was grave as he acknowledged me. "Amanda, thank you for joining us on short notice. As you're aware, this morning's Wall Street Journal article has created some immediate challenges we need to address." I nodded, keeping my expression composed. "I understand completely, Thomas. For what it's worth, I had no involvement in or prior knowledge of this story." Marcus shifted uncomfortably in his seat but said nothing. "Our primary concern," Thomas continued, "is managing client and regulatory perceptions. The journal's framing raises questions about governance, transparency, and potential conflicts of interest in our decision-making processes." "Those are legitimate concerns," I acknowledged, though I would note that my ownership position has existed for 7 years without any governance issues precisely because I've maintained appropriate separation between my personal interests and the bank's operations. "Until the board meeting regarding your accounts," Marcus interjected, unable to restrain himself. I met his gaze through the video screen. "The board meeting you called at Richard's request to restrict my financial access without my knowledge or consent. That meeting, Marcus?" Thomas raised a hand to prevent further back and forth. "What's done is done. Our focus now must be forward-looking. We need a clear communication strategy for clients, regulators, and the media." The discussion continued for nearly an hour, resulting in a measured approach. The bank would issue a brief statement acknowledging the ownership structure, affirming its compliance with all regulatory requirements, and emphasizing the institution's commitment to governance best practices. I would limit my public comments, referring banking questions to official channels while keeping any divorce-related matters strictly separate. As the meeting concluded, Thomas addressed me directly. "Amanda, a word privately." The other executives filed out, leaving just Thomas on the video call. "This situation is unfortunate," he began once we were alone, "but not unsalvageable. I've reviewed your voting record on board matters over the past 7 years. Your proxy representatives have consistently supported initiatives that strengthened the bank's position, often pushing for improvements before they became industry standards. My interest has always been in the bank's long-term success," I replied. "Simply?" He nodded thoughtfully. "Which raises an interesting question about your future role. Now that your position is public, maintaining the arm's-length arrangement through proxies seems unnecessary. The board would benefit from your direct participation." The offer caught me by surprise. "Are you suggesting I join the board formally?" "It would address the transparency concerns while allowing us to benefit from your evident strategic capabilities," Thomas replied. "Something to consider, at any rate. Though I understand your personal circumstances may make this a complicated time for such decisions." After ending the call, I sat back, contemplating this unexpected development. A formal board position would significantly raise my profile in the financial world, creating a platform entirely independent of Richard. It would also complicate the divorce proceedings, potentially creating leverage, but also additional scrutiny. Before I could analyze this further, my phone rang again. This time it was my mother's neurologist, Dr. Abrams. "Mrs. Grayson," he began, his tone professionally concerned. "I wanted to check in about your mother's care plan." We received notification this morning that the payment authorization for her treatments has been modified. My stomach tightened. Modified how, exactly? The automatic payment from your account has been canceled. Instead, we received instructions that future invoices should be submitted to an assistant at Grayson Halliday for manual approval and payment. Despite his assurances the previous night, Richard had already moved to place my mother's medical care under his control, a power play disguised as continued support. That's incorrect, I said firmly. Please disregard those instructions. I'll have new payment arrangements set up today that will provide continuous automatic coverage without any third-party approval requirements. After assuring Dr. Abrams that there would be no disruption to my mother's care, I immediately called Stephanie, the private banking representative who had visited yesterday. I need the new account structure for my mother's medical expenses activated immediately, I explained. Richard has already attempted to reroute her treatment payments through his office. I'll handle it personally, Stephanie assured me. We can have the new payment system in place within hours, with retroactive coverage to ensure no gaps. That, crisis averted, I checked my emails to find a message from Margaret Prescott's assistant requesting I join Margaret for lunch at her apartment. The timing was fortuitous. I needed Margaret's counsel on both the journal article and Thomas's board position offer. As I prepared to leave for Margaret's, James called again. Amanda, we've received an emergency motion filing from Caldwell, he said without preamble. Richard is seeking a temporary restraining order regarding your Northeastern regional voting rights, claiming conflict of interest and potential damage to marital assets. Can he do that? I asked, surprised by the aggressive move. He can try, James replied. It's a legally dubious approach, but it accomplishes two things for him. It creates a narrative where your banking position is characterized as potentially harmful rather than impressive, and it forces us to respond quickly, potentially pushing us into defensive positioning. What's your recommendation? We counterfile immediately, documenting Richard's financial maneuvers with Momentum Ventures and his attempt to control your mother's medical care. We position his restraining order request as part of a pattern of financial coercion. Do it, I authorized. And James, make sure the filing emphasizes that my ownership position predates any marital issues by years, while his restrictive actions began immediately upon deciding to leave. The complications were mounting rapidly. Richard was mobilizing on multiple fronts, legal, financial, and now medical, in an attempt to regain control of the situation. The public exposure had accelerated his timeline, forcing him into more aggressive tactics than he might otherwise have employed at this stage. Margaret's Park Avenue apartment occupied an entire floor of a pre-war building with a liveried doorman and hushed, elegant lobby. I'd visited many times over the years, usually for foundation-related discussions or social events. Today, the doorman greeted me with a knowing look, suggesting he'd seen the journal article. Mrs. Prescott is expecting you, Mrs. Grayson, he said, escorting me to the private elevator. She asked me to bring you up immediately. Margaret was waiting when the elevator doors opened directly into her foyer, elegant as always in a tailored pantsuit, her silver bob perfectly styled. Without preamble, she handed me the journal article, already folded to highlight a particular passage. Third paragraph from the end, she instructed. Read it carefully. I scanned to the indicated section. Sources close to Grayson suggest the banking relationship may have influenced investment decisions at Grayson Halliday, raising questions about whether clients received fully independent advice given this previously undisclosed connection. He's playing dirty, I observed, recognizing the implied threat. Richard was suggesting my banking position might have compromised his firm's investment advice, a serious accusation in the wealth management world. Of course he is, Margaret replied, leading me into her dining room where lunch was already set. He's trying to shift the narrative from his personal misconduct to professional ethics concerns. Classic deflection. James just called. Richard filed for a restraining order on my voting rights at the bank. Margaret seemed unsurprised as she took her seat at the table. A legal nuisance tactic. It won't succeed, but it creates a cloud of controversy he can leverage in other ways. And he's already tried to reroute my mother's medical payments through his office, I added, accepting a glass of water from Margaret's housekeeper. Controlling medical care is particularly insidious, Margaret noted with disgust. It establishes him as the compassionate provider, while making you dependent on his goodwill for your mother's well-being. We discussed strategy throughout lunch, with Margaret offering clear-eyed analysis of each complication as it emerged. When I mentioned Thomas's offer of a formal board position, she set down her fork with interest. That's unexpected at this stage, she observed. Thomas is typically more cautious about governance changes. He seemed to think it would address transparency concerns while allowing the bank to benefit from my evident strategic capabilities, I quoted. Margaret's lips curved in a small smile. His phrasing, not yours, I assume. But he's not wrong. You've contributed significantly to the bank's improvements, even if your involvement has been deliberately obscured until now. Should I accept? She considered the question carefully. It depends on your longer-term objectives. A board position would establish your independent financial identity more firmly, but it would also place you under intense scrutiny during an already complicated time. Richard would hate it, I noted. Yes, Margaret agreed. But that shouldn't be your primary consideration. What matters is whether it advances your strategic position in meaningful ways. Before I could respond, my phone buzzed with a news alert. The New York Times had published a profile of Vanessa Porter, highlighting her meteoric rise at Grayson Halliday and noting her close professional relationship with Richard Grayson. The piece made no explicit mention of any personal involvement, but included a photograph of them together at a recent industry conference, their body language suggesting intimacy beyond professional collegiality. They're attempting to normalize their relationship publicly, Margaret observed, reading the article over my shoulder. Establishing her professional credentials to counter any narrative that might emerge about an affair. The timing is suspicious, I agreed. This feels like a planted story. Without question, Margaret confirmed. Richard is mobilizing his media contacts to shape the narrative before more details of your separation become public. My phone rang again, Eleanor this time. Amanda, we have another situation developing, she said, her voice tight with controlled tension. 2 major clients have received calls from Richard suggesting they should consider moving their accounts from Northeastern Regional due to governance uncertainties that might impact their funds. I felt a flash of cold anger. Richard was using his client relationships to attack the bank directly. Which clients? I asked. The Whitmore Foundation and Preston Capital, Eleanor replied. Both have significant deposits and lending relationships with us. Combined exposure of approximately $220 million. Let me guess. Both are also investment clients of Grayson Halliday. Yes, with Richard as their primary advisor. Preston's CFO specifically mentioned that Richard raised concerns about potential conflicts impacting proper banking oversight, given the personal situation. I relayed this information to Margaret, whose expression hardened. He's playing a dangerous game, she observed after Eleanor's call ended. Using client relationships as weapons in a personal dispute violates several ethical boundaries. The SEC takes a dim view of investment advisors who leverage client relationships for personal advantage. What's his angle? I wondered aloud. He has to know this creates potential regulatory issues for himself as well. He's betting you won't escalate to that level, Margaret replied, that you'll back off to protect the bank's client relationships rather than allow a public fight that could damage both institutions. She wasn't wrong. Richard was calculating that my sense of responsibility toward Northeastern Regional would override my personal interests in the divorce. He was using the bank, my bank, as leverage against me. We need to neutralize this client situation immediately, I decided. if word spreads that significant clients are considering leaving due to governance concerns, it could trigger broader instability. Agreed, Margaret said. But the response needs to be institutional, not personal. Thomas should reach out directly to both client CEOs, not the CFOs Richard has already influenced. He needs to provide clear assurance about governance stability. As I prepared to call Thomas, James called with yet another complication. Amanda, Richard's attorney has just filed an emergency petition regarding the Westchester house, he reported. They're claiming abandonment of the marital home and seeking immediate exclusive occupancy rights for Richard. I've been gone for 2 days, I protested. How could they possibly claim abandonment? They're arguing that your move to the 4 seasons combined with removal of personal items constitutes intent to vacate. It's a stretch legally, but it creates another front we need to defend. The strategy was becoming clear. Richard was generating multiple simultaneous complications across different domains: banking relationships, client accounts, legal filings, medical care access, property rights, forcing me to divide my attention and resources. It was the same approach he used in complex business negotiations. Create enough pressure points that your opponent must concede some to protect others. I need to return to the house immediately, I told James. Not permanently, but enough to clearly establish I haven't abandoned it. I'd advise having a witness with you, James suggested. Richard or his representatives might be there, and any interaction should be documented. After ending the call, I explained the situation to Margaret. She immediately offered her driver and suggested her personal assistant accompany me as a witness. This is merely the opening salvo, she warned as I prepared to leave. Richard is testing your resolve and capacity to manage multiple fronts simultaneously. How you respond to these initial complications will set the tone for everything that follows. En route to Westchester, I called Thomas to address the client situation. He shared my concerns about Richard's tactics. Using client relationships as leverage in a personal dispute crosses several ethical lines, he noted. I'll contact both CEOs directly this afternoon. But Amanda, you should be aware, our compliance team has flagged unusual transaction patterns involving Grace and Halliday client accounts over the past 3 months. What kind of patterns? I asked, instantly alert. Several high-net-worth clients have established new LLCs with similar structures to Momentum Ventures. Significant funds have moved through these entities, eventually flowing to offshore accounts with limited transparency. All technically legal, but unusual for traditional wealth management clients. This was potentially significant, not just for my divorce situation, but possibly indicating broader concerns about Richard's business practices. Is there any direct connection to Richard personally? I asked carefully. Nothing explicit in the transaction records, Thomas replied. But all involved clients are under his direct advisory relationship. Our compliance team flagged it as part of their standard monitoring, but given recent developments, I thought you should be aware. This information added a new dimension to my understanding of Richard's financial maneuvers. Momentum Ventures might not be an isolated entity created for our divorce, but part of a larger pattern involving client funds. If Richard was engaged in questionable practices with client money, it created both vulnerability and risk. Leverage I might potentially use, but also complications I needed to understand fully before proceeding. As the car approached our Westchester home, I noticed an unfamiliar black SUV parked in the driveway. Margaret's assistant, Lisa, documented its presence with photos as we pulled alongside it. Would you like me to accompany you inside? Lisa offered. Yes, please, I replied, steeling myself for whatever confrontation might await. I used my key to enter through the front door, calling out as I stepped into the foyer. Hello? Is someone here? Movement from the kitchen caught my attention. A moment later, Vanessa Porter appeared in the hallway, her expression registering surprise and then embarrassment as she recognized me. Mrs. Grayson, she said, recovering. quickly. I wasn't expecting you. Evidently, I replied coolly, noting she wore casual clothes, jeans, and one of Richard's Harvard sweatshirts, suggesting a comfort level in my home that sent a fresh wave of anger through me. I don't believe we've been formally introduced. You're wearing my husband's clothing in my house, but we haven't actually met properly. She had the grace to look uncomfortable. Richard asked me to collect some documents from his study. He said, "You'd moved out?" As you can see, that information was incorrect. I gestured to Lisa, who stood slightly behind me. This is Lisa Conway, who's witnessing this encounter. Are you here alone? Vanessa nodded, shifting her weight nervously. Yes. Richard is in meetings all day. He gave me his key this morning. The calculated insult of sending his girlfriend to retrieve items from our home wasn't lost on me. Whether Vanessa understood she was being used as a pawn in Richard's strategy was less clear. I see, I said evenly. Well, since you're here under false pretenses, I'll need to ask you to leave immediately. Whatever documents Richard needs, he can request through proper legal channels. I don't think that's, she began. This isn't a negotiation, Ms. Porter. I interrupted firmly. You are in my home without my permission, wearing my husband's clothes less than 72 hours after he left our marriage. You have exactly 2 minutes to collect your personal belongings and leave, or I will call the police and report you for trespassing. Her eyes widened slightly at the direct approach. She clearly hadn't expected to encounter me, and Richard had, evidently not prepared her for this possibility. Richard said the house would eventually be his in the settlement, she offered, making a final attempt at asserting some legitimacy to her presence. Richard says many things, I replied. Most of them self-serving and few of them entirely truthful. 1 minute, 30 seconds remaining. Outmaneuvered, Vanessa retreated to the kitchen, returning moments later with her purse and a leather portfolio. She removed Richard's sweatshirt, revealing a simple t-shirt underneath, and draped it over the stair banister. This isn't personal, she said as she moved toward the door. Richard and it's not what you think. Ms. Porter, you're in my house wearing my husband's clothes while he files legal motions claiming I've abandoned the property, I responded. Whatever narrative you've constructed about your relationship with Richard, I suggest you consider his pattern of behavior carefully before investing too deeply in his version of events. After she left, Lisa documented the house's condition with photographs, noting various items that appeared to have been disturbed or removed since I'd last been there. In Richard's study, several file drawers stood partially open, and spaces on his bookshelves suggested volumes had been removed. This should help counter any abandonment claim, Lisa observed as we completed our documentation. Your personal items are clearly still here, and you've now reasserted your occupancy rights. As we prepared to leave, my phone rang again. Eleanor, her voice tense with yet another development. Amanda, I just received word that Richard has called an emergency investor meeting at Grayson Halliday for tomorrow morning, she reported. The stated purpose is to address governance concerns regarding financial relationships that may impact client interests. He specifically invited representatives from their largest institutional clients. The implications were clear. Richard was preparing to publicly position my banking ownership as a potential conflict that threatened his firm's integrity, a preemptive strike designed to control the narrative and paint himself as the responsible fiduciary protecting client interests. He's escalating faster than expected, I noted, a cold determination replacing my earlier anger. Time to implement contingency measures. As I ended the call with Eleanor, I surveyed the home Richard and I had shared for nearly 2 decades. The accumulated memories, achievements, and disappointments of our marriage surrounded me in photographs, art pieces selected together, furniture arranged for our particular habits and preferences. For a brief moment, grief threatened to overtake my strategic focus, not just grief for the marriage ending, but for the realization that the partnership I'd believed in had always been conditional on my remaining in the supportive role Richard had assigned me. The moment I demonstrated independent power, he'd moved to neutralize me through any means available. "Are you all right, Mrs. Grayson?" Lisa asked gently. I straightened my shoulders, compartmentalizing the personal pain to focus on the immediate challenges. "Yes, and please, call me Amanda. Mrs. Grayson is a title that's rapidly becoming obsolete." Back in the car, I called James to update him on both the house situation and Richard's planned investor meeting. "He's moving aggressively on multiple fronts," James observed. "This investor meeting is particularly concerning. He's using his professional platform to potentially damage your reputation." "It's time to activate our more assertive countermeasures," I decided. Richard is clearly not interested in a measured, private resolution. He's chosen to make this a public battle fought across multiple domains. "I'll prepare the necessary filings," James confirmed. "But Amanda, you should be aware, once we shift to a more aggressive posture, de-escalation becomes significantly more difficult." "I understand," I replied, watching the Westchester landscape pass by the car window. "But Richard has already demonstrated his approach. He tried to cut me off financially. He's attempting to control my mother's medical care. He's using his professional position to attack my reputation. He sent his girlfriend to our home wearing his clothes." "Each of those actions reveals something important about his character and intentions," James agreed. "So what's our next move?" I thought about the chess metaphor Margaret had used the previous night. Richard was playing an aggressive opening game, sacrificing positional advantage for immediate pressure. But in doing so, he was creating vulnerabilities a patient opponent could exploit. "It's time to show Richard exactly who he's playing against," I said finally, "and remind him that in chess, the queen is the most powerful piece on the board for a reason." 10 years had passed since that October morning when Richard walked out of our bedroom with a suitcase and the misguided confidence that he could control our financial separation. A decade since he'd discovered that the woman he'd dismissed as intellectually inferior controlled the very bank he'd tried to use against me. I stood at the window of my corner office in the Northeastern Financial Tower, the gleaming 50-story headquarters that had replaced the old Northeastern Regional. Building 5 years ago. From this height, Manhattan spread before me like a living map, each building and street representing possibilities that hadn't existed in my imagination that fateful morning. "Mrs. Grayson? They're ready for you in the boardroom," my assistant, Michael, announced from the doorway. "Thank you, Michael. And remember, the Peterson Foundation representatives are coming at 2. Make sure the impact reports are ready for distribution." He nodded efficiently and withdrew as I gathered my tablet and notes. The quarterly board meeting would be my last as CEO, a position I'd held for 7 years after serving 3 years as chairperson. My retirement announcement had generated substantial business press coverage, with the Wall Street Journal running a feature titled "Banking's Unexpected Revolutionary: How Amanda Grayson Transformed Regional Banking." The irony wasn't lost on me. The journal's exposure of my ownership position a decade ago had been intended to create scandal. Now they were celebrating my legacy. The boardroom fell silent as I entered. 14 directors, 7 women and 7 men, a balance I'd insisted upon, rose in a gesture of respect that still caught me off guard sometimes. "Good morning, everyone," I began once seated. "We have a full agenda today, but before we begin, I want to thank you all for your service to this institution. Northeastern Financial's transformation from a traditional regional bank to the country's leading digital banking innovator is a testament to collaborative leadership and shared vision." The meeting progressed efficiently through quarterly results. Exceptional, expansion plans, ambitious, and succession planning, meticulous. My replacement, Ellen Chen, no relation but a brilliant strategist I'd recruited from a major West Coast bank 4 years earlier, presented her vision for the next phase of our growth. As the meeting concluded, Thomas Reynolds, now in his 70s, but still serving as a director emeritus, approached me with a warm smile. "I remember when you first revealed your ownership position," he reminisced. I thought it was the most surprising development of my banking career. Little did I know it was just the opening chapter of a remarkable transformation story. For both the bank and me, I acknowledged. Though I could have done without some of the drama that followed. Thomas chuckled. The financial press still occasionally references the Grayson divorce in articles about business ethics. Your ex-husband provided quite the cautionary tale. Indeed, he had. Richard's aggressive tactics had backfired spectacularly in ways neither of us could have anticipated that first week. His emergency investor meeting, intended to position my banking ownership as a conflict, had derailed when a Wall Street Journal reporter asked about the unusual client account structures similar to Momentum Ventures. Richard's visible discomfort had prompted further investigation, eventually revealing that he'd been using client funds to finance personal investments without proper disclosures. The SEC investigation had been devastating for both Richard and Grayson Halliday. By the time the dust settled 8 months later, the firm had paid substantial fines. Richard had surrendered his securities licenses, and 3 senior partners had disassociated themselves from him entirely. Vanessa Porter had jumped ship early. In the process, accepting a position with a competitor and giving a tearful interview to Bloomberg about being misled regarding both personal and professional matters by Richard. Her carefully constructed narrative as the innocent party had preserved her career, though I'd heard through industry channels that she remained viewed with some suspicion. Our divorce had been finalized with terms dramatically different from the $3,000 monthly allowance Richard had initially envisioned. Without his financial industry credentials and under regulatory scrutiny, his negotiating position had collapsed. The settlement had been more than fair. I'd insisted on that, not wanting even a hint of vindictiveness. But the true victory had been in the complete reversal of power dynamics. Margaret sends her regards, Thomas added, interrupting my reflections. She's sorry she couldn't attend your final board meeting. At 82, Margaret had stepped back from active involvement in business matters, but remained a dear friend and occasional advisor. Her insights had guided many of my most successful initiatives, including the acquisition of 3 smaller banks that had transformed Northeastern Regional into Northeastern Financial, now the 5th largest banking institution in the country. Tell her I'll visit next week, I replied. She promised to share her thoughts on the Peterson Foundation proposal. After the meeting, I returned to my office to find Eleanor waiting. Now in her 60s, she'd served as my CFO throughout our expansion phase before transitioning to a consulting role focused on industry innovation. So, she said, settling into the chair across from my desk, how does it feel knowing that was your last board meeting as CEO? Surreal, I admitted. When I took control of this office, I was still figuring out who I was beyond Richard Grayson's ex-wife. Now I can hardly remember that version of myself. Eleanor smiled knowingly. You've built something remarkable, Amanda. Not just the bank's transformation, but your own. We built it, I corrected her. You, Margaret, Thomas. Even James, who's still handling our legal affairs after all these years. Speaking of building things, Eleanor said, placing a newspaper on my desk. Have you seen this? It was the New York Times business section. A small article near the bottom of the page reported that Richard Grayson had filed for personal bankruptcy protection, citing unsustainable debt obligations and limited income prospects. The piece noted it was his 2nd bankruptcy filing in 5 years. I scanned the article without emotion. Richard's financial decline had been steady and largely self-inflicted. After losing his securities licenses, he attempted several business ventures, a cryptocurrency investment firm, a financial advisory newsletter, a short-lived hedge fund targeting alternative investments, each ending with investor disappointment and further damage to his reputation. I'd heard through mutual acquaintances that he'd moved to Florida 3 years ago, presumably for the homestead exemption that protected assets from creditors. This bankruptcy filing suggested even that strategy had failed. Does it give you any satisfaction? Eleanor asked carefully. After what he tried to do to you? I considered the question seriously. Not satisfied exactly. More like confirmation. That character ultimately matters more than credentials or connections. Richard always believed he was the smartest person in any room. That certainty made him successful until it made him careless. While you built an empire, Eleanor observed. An enterprise, I corrected gently. Empires fall, enterprises evolve, and Northeastern Financial had certainly evolved. Under my leadership, we'd pioneered banking services for underserved communities, developed industry-leading financial literacy programs, and created innovative lending models for women entrepreneurs. The Elizabeth Chen Foundation, named for my mother, who had passed away 6 years ago, had funded education for thousands of first-generation college students. My phone chimed with a calendar reminder, 15 minutes until my video call with the Treasury Secretary to discuss the bank's financial inclusion initiatives. The days remained full, even as I prepared for transition. "Will you miss it?" Eleanor asked, gesturing to the office with its symbols of corporate power. "Parts of it?" I acknowledged. The ability to implement ideas at scale, the talented people, the sense of building something meaningful. I smiled at my oldest friend. But I'm ready for whatever comes next. What came next was already taking shape. The Peterson Foundation had approached me about leading a global initiative focused on financial systems in developing economies. Several universities had extended visiting professor invitations. 3 corporate boards had expressed interest in my governance expertise. Options I couldn't have imagined when Richard left me with a $3,000 monthly allowance and the assumption I'd be too overwhelmed to fight back. As Eleanor left to meet with our innovation team, I took a final moment to appreciate the view from the office that had been the center of my professional life for 7 years. The Manhattan skyline had changed during the decade since Richard's betrayal. New buildings rising, others renovated or repurposed, the city constantly reinventing itself while maintaining its essential character. My transformation had followed a similar pattern. The foundation had remained. My intelligence, determination, and strategic thinking had always been there, even when Richard failed to recognize them. But I'd built something new and unexpected on that foundation, something that exceeded any future I might have imagined while supporting Richard's career. He had tried to cut me off financially, not knowing I owned his bank. That initial miscalculation had triggered a cascade of consequences neither of us could have predicted. Richard had lost everything he valued: professional standing, financial security, social position. I had discovered capabilities and created opportunities I might never have recognized within the constraints of our marriage. My assistant appeared at the door. "The Treasury Secretary is on the line whenever you're ready." "Thank you, Michael. I'll take it now." As I settled at my desk to take the call, I glanced once more at the bankruptcy article. There had been a time when I'd wanted Richard to recognize how profoundly he'd underestimated me, to acknowledge the magnitude of his miscalculation. I'd imagined a moment of reckoning when he would finally see me clearly. But I realized now that his recognition had become irrelevant long ago. The validation I'd once craved from Richard had been replaced by the quiet confidence that comes from building something meaningful entirely on one's own terms. He had tried to make me small. Instead, he had inadvertently set me free, and that was a resolution far more satisfying than revenge. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.